So it's so awesome for me to sit with you guys today and explain to you guys how the U.S. military uses the different aspects of LARPing, to train its soldiers. Now, I'm speaking on behalf of myself as a member of the Armed Forces. I'm not talking for the Army, but we're going to share, you're going to notice there's a lot of similarities in what we do to train soldiers versus what I did yesterday in being a vampire, right? It's almost the exact same thing, and I think the similarities are pretty amazing. So just a quick note, our presentation just has some pictures of real soldiers engaged in simulated combat. So in no way will I be talking about real stuff. It's all make-believe, right? But just so you know, we're going to be talking about those type of situations, casualties, things like that. All right. So viewer discretion is advised. All right. And now that that's taken care of, we can go into war stories, right? So let me tell you about a story. So there was a 10-man team of special operations soldiers, and they were visiting a local village leader in the country of Pineland. And they're in these armored vehicles right here. These are called MRAPs. There were also some Humvees in there as well. And they were dispersed among the vehicles, fully loaded. Each vehicle has a crew-served weapon, and they all have their own personal weapons and everything like that. And they're going into a pretty dangerous situation. But the the purpose of this meeting with this local village leader is to help them identify security concerns in the area, and then to help them mitigate those concerns by offering additional patrols in the area and things like that. So they had a great meeting with the local leader. They exchanged pleasantries, they got down to business, they drank tea, and everything was well and good. As the soldiers were leaving, though, they were engaged by small arms fire from the rooftops. The soldiers returned fire and then escaped in their vehicles back to base. So they returned fire, bad guys got away, and they returned to base. En route back to base, they were hit by an IED, an improvised explosive device, that damaged one of their trucks. But they did a quick check with each other, and they just kept moving out, right? There's no reason to stop. Exploded, they keep moving. As they approached the base, the patrol leader, Captain Garcia, tells the driver to stop the truck. The driver should stop the truck. He says, "I think I'm hit," and he's bleeding from his left side. He grabs the left side and opens the truck door and falls out of it. The driver stands there frozen with his hands on the wheel, while the gunner in the vehicle is like, "Hey, what's wrong with that guy?" The driver says, "I don't know." The gunner's like, "Well, check on him," right? And the driver says, "I can't, I'm driving." And that's where our story begins. Right, so I'm going to leave that on a cliffhanger, and we'll talk about what actually happened. Now, that whole situation in the story I told you was in a simulated combat environment. It was in a training center in Fort Bragg. It didn't really happen. There wasn't really explosion. There wasn't really soldiers. The soldiers were participating in that exercise, and that whole thing happened to them, but of course, nobody's actually bleeding or anything like that. So that's all, those similarities between that, what happened there, and that patrol, has a lot of similarities with what happens in LARP. So as I'm going to break down to you, is talk about how the Army uses LARP, why do we use LARP, and what goals do we meet by using LARP? What are the types of LARP that the Army does? And what are some of the basic concepts that I see as LARP designers that you can use from what we do? All right, so that's how we're going to break it down. So why LARP? LARP stands for live action role playing, right? The United States Army does a lot of roles in its work. Here, just top left picture is just one of those Humvees in Iraq doing a security patrol. Top right, you have a vehicle, and they were doing rescuing people from Hurricane Harvey. So it's disaster relief and humanitarian assistance. On the bottom left is soldiers on the border assisting the border guard doing surveillance. And on the bottom right is soldiers conducting foreign internal defense, which they're helping train other nations' militaries so that they can deal with the insurgencies and help decrease violence in their own countries. These are all completely different roles that fit under the category of the soldier. So wouldn't it make sense to, as we train soldiers in these roles, that we have some live action role playing of those roles, right? So that's why we could use LARP and why we do use LARP in some situations in the Army. So what's the goal? There's a big difference in muscle memory and critical thinking, as we all understand. When people think about the Army, they usually think about the infantry soldier, right? The soldier with body armor and a weapon. His job is to close with and destroy the enemy by means of small arms fire. That's just the mission of the infantry. What they need to understand with their training is muscle memory. They need to be able to react instinctively, quickly, and they make split-second decisions that their lives depend on, right? So they need to train for muscle memory. So when we're designing a training event for them, we're not thinking about political grievances and concerns of the populace and logistical effects and things like that. We want to help this soldier, put him in a situation where they have to execute this muscle memory as quickly as possible and then turn it back off. Turn it back on and turn it back off, right? So that's, if your goal is that, you design differently than if you want to do this, the scenario picture on the right, which is critical thinking. Here we have two soldiers in the US Embassy talking with the defense attaché, who's the senior military official for that embassy, and they're in charge of like basically political discourse and political and military discourse with that country's military. Both of these are soldiers, but the one on your right, they need to think of second and third order effects. They need to control their language. They need to control, be aware of political landmines, right? Talking about things that don't affect the country negatively. Making sure that the U.S. mission is basically one line, but the policies are all in line together, right? So for example, if our policy is to deal with climate change, the soldiers, if they don't believe in climate change, they can't say that, right? They have to they have to toe the party line in that and discuss that the same way. So the scenario on the right, that situation, they'll be able to train to that effect, okay? So basically, you have to understand what's your goal when designing a LARP, and the military does it. They understand how can we design our training to meet each of these separate requirements. Now, in my case, I work at the Special Operations Center. We evaluate and train highly specialized adaptive thinking special operations soldiers to deploy to austere locations in permissive or hostile environments to do the job that we send them to do, basically, right? This requires an exceptional amount of critical thinking, and not everybody can do this. This is why it's a highly selective process that lasts years to help get these soldiers to see if they are capable of doing it, to train them, and then put them out and actually have them do missions. So if our goal is to train these type of individuals, how can we do that? How can we put them in an adaptive situation that simulates permissive and hostile environments, right? We send, when our students graduate our course, they can literally be a two-man mission in the Indonesian embassy working on disaster relief for a recent volcano eruption. Or they could be a four-man team in the middle of Nigeria talking with a warlord to get them to stop human trafficking Boko Haram victims, right? I literally had soldiers deployed to both those regions right after they graduated. So how do we create the dynamic to train them and test them to see if they're capable of operating in this area? You can't just take a test, right? Discuss political grievances, check. You cannot do that. You need something more dynamic, and that's why we used live action role-playing and training. So the Army does not define this at all in the way I'm defining it, but we understand that there's nuance in that. The military uses different types of LARPs for different reasons. So there's situational LARPs, which just cover a specific instance where it's a very canned event. that's just for one purpose. This picture is a sexual harassment and assault response program initiative where soldiers get together and they discuss how we are one team in one fight, and that sexual harassment and assault is not tolerated and everything like that. However, in this case, it's led by a facilitator, and instead of doing our normal online quarterly training that we do, we actually role play in this, and they discuss different situations, and they ask soldiers what they think, and the legal expert talks, and then the commander talks, and things like that. So they work through these issues in order to train our soldiers to be better at their job. Other types of situational LARPs would be small one-day events that deal with a specific task. For example, we have an airborne unit that conducts aerial insertion operations where they get all their gear, get loaded up on an aircraft, and get deployed over an airfield. And their job is to conduct their military maneuvers to seize that airfield for follow-on forces. If they're going to do something like that, usually it involves very minimal story, very minimal narrative and things like that. It's bottom line, when the private asks, what are we doing? You're seizing an airfield. That's it. We don't need to create all the fiction about the area or pretend it's somewhere else or anything like that. We're seizing Luzon Airfield, 0300 tomorrow, jumping out of aircraft to do it. You organize with your squad and execute. So this isn't like, it's not dynamic, right? You're jumping out of aircraft, you're loading weapons, you're doing all this stuff, but it's not story-based or anything like that. So those are situational LARPs. The live action LARP is something that's very unique to special operations and other things. This is when soldiers go to a place such as the National Training Center in Fort Irwin or the Joint Readiness Training Center in Fort Polk, Louisiana, and they conduct a multi-day, multi-week exercise fighting fictional enemies in fictional countries. Some of our famous enemies are like the Atropians, and we always say no U.S. blood for Atropian oil and things like that, right? We create this interesting dynamic where they have to do a full deployment of all of their gear into this fictional country and then execute combat operations against a fictional enemy in that area. We have graders in that, and we have observers, and we have all these different moving pieces with that. Very expensive, multi-billion-dollar operations. For close to home to me in Fort Bragg, we do another type of evaluation where it's a live action event. Our soldiers deploy to the same fictional country called Pineland. They have extraordinary political situations and dynamics with over 80 different characters, with very deep historic context with those characters. And after the soldiers meet these individuals over a course of missions for a couple days, we turn it into the live action portion, and then from then on, whatever the students do and plan is free form. So the student says, I want to go to this water treatment plant to meet with this engineer to discuss the water issues. Behind the scenes, magically, we make that happen. And then 4 hours later, when they show up at the water plant, that water engineer's there for them to talk to. But here's the thing. When they tell that water engineer, hey, we'll be back with your generator tomorrow, right? And they don't show up the next day with that generator, bad things happen. And this is exactly where the magic happens. Their actions have second and third order effects. Their actions have consequences or the lack of actions, just like in real life. The reason why we do civil military operations in real life is that humans operate on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. With the bottom is what? What's the bottom need, basic need for humans, for Maslow's hierarchy of need?
Air.
Air?
It's like physical safety.
Like it said, well, people always think it's like the biological need of air. Security is usually the one.
Okay.
It's really Wi-Fi. We all know that, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's Wi-Fi.
It's really Wi-Fi. But no, it's really it's security first, and then it goes up to self-actualization at the top, right? However, when people don't have their needs met, they hold grievances. If the government or the community cannot accomplish their grievances, bad things happen. So if there's a disaster and they don't have food, and they don't have water, and they don't have security, they're going to grab onto the nearest thing to them. And if Al-Qaeda rolls up with boxes full of food and armed guards and law and order, they're going to fall in with them and then work for them. And that's historically proven with those situations. So what we do is we work with those governments to decrease those civil vulnerabilities and mitigate them. And this training does exactly that. If the soldiers do not execute those tasks, bad things happen, and they have to deal with those consequences, which doesn't make things good for them. All right, so those are the basic ideas of how we do our training. Now I'm going to explain how I designed the training situations I did for my soldiers, right? Rule number one is set the rules, right? You always need the rules so we know what's happening. In the Army training, our weapons have blank adapters on them. So they're not actually shooting real bullets. And I always have to remind, hey soldier, your weapon has a blank adapter on it. We're not really in war. Like this is, we have to be safe in what we do, right? You can't just go up and punch that guy in the face. You have to say you're going to do it. These are real soldiers. This is your brother in arms. You can't just do that. So you always have to manage your expectations in that. Real bullets, shooting during training does not end well. There is a time and place for that, but not when you're live action role playing and doing scenario-based training. So you have to set a structure, you have to set safety. We all want to, sad statistic is last month more soldiers died in training than in war, right? And that's usually the case. But, because what we do is inherently dangerous, but we have to make sure we follow the risk procedures. This is some excellent mobile force protection course out in North Carolina where we do evasive driving, we pit cars, we crash into each other, we do dead driver drills where we're going 40 miles an hour and we have to pull the person out of the driver's seat and take control of the car while driving and people are shooting at you with paintballs. Very fun. I highly recommend it. But you have to be safe in doing that. And there's a reason why the Army doesn't conduct that training. We have to go to a contractor to do that, right? So that's number one. Two, build a world. You gotta frame it in location, give it boundaries so that they know where they are at all times. So sometimes our training areas blend and sometimes other people step into our training area or we step on other people. We have to ensure that they understand what are the boundaries and who's playing and who's not. You got to build a story and make it deeper than you ever expected so that people can think critically and achieve their goals. If you just fluff it up and give you the basic top, it doesn't do anything for them. You need them to be able to reach a different level. In this training right here, we designed a fake deployment to Papua New Guinea, and this guy's conducting an equipment handover ceremony to the Ministry of Defense. During this event, they were able to talk to the civilians to get really great information about their disaster programs, and also there was counterintelligence officers that took their opportunity to get information from my soldiers as well. Right? So that's a great training opportunity. Hey, remember that girl with the really short skirt that you were talking to all nice? She took all your information. And who does she work for? You don't know, do you? Well, now you know, and knowing's half the battle, right? Kids these days don't know that reference, by the way.
I got it.
But you have to set that framing and give that story. The next thing is you have to have support for what you do. No matter what you do, you need people to run it. And LARPs, that could get really expensive, and you need volunteers, and you need all this complicated stuff. In our exercise, we have extensive support. We have site managers, we have the students themselves, we have small group instructors which manage the students, and they're like the overall person who gives the students, you are able to deploy to achieve our nation's objectives abroad, or you go back to your basic branch, right? We have the environment, we have facilities, we have other role players who need to be trained, and they need all their rules as well. And then you have bad guys who are actually other soldiers playing as the enemy. And then we have all these props. But you need to manage all of these things effectively to create your desired world. If you don't have a generator there and you're talking about a generator, people have to do a lot more mental backflips to get to where they need to be. So trying to make it as real as possible within your budget makes sense. And that's what we do. A key thing for our SGIs is that they're also mentors and evaluators. So they're the ones that lead the AAR process, the after-action review process, the experiential learning model process, and things like that. They're the ones that help soldiers better understand what they do. Our soldiers learn through trauma and repetition, and we like to give them repetitive trauma. So we give them the opportunity to fail a lot, and then we have them understand what they did, understand the situation in which they did it, and then change that. You have to give your players and the soldiers a mission and hit play and let it go. Their purpose is going to drive their innovation and ability to make decisions. If you lock them in a box and just tell them this is your boundaries, they're not going to do anything. But you have to be able to be flexible to their needs within reason. It's really an art versus a science. If soldiers want to wear uniforms, let them wear uniforms. If they want to go somewhere else, let them go somewhere else, just as long as they've reached their training objectives or your objectives as a LARP designer. So talking about the experiential learning model, it's really based on self-reflection and the internal evaluation of that person, and that's when learning occurs. After the small scenarios that we do in our training, we always have an after-action review where we go through the student and ask them very important questions. What was your mission? What happened? What was your mission? What was supposed to happen? What happened? Why do you think that is? Right? And they're able to talk through all their reasons, which gives you lessons that you learn, you collect those lessons, and then you adapt your process later on, and the soldiers, most importantly, understand their internal methods and can use what they garnered in future instances. We tell our soldiers they'll never see this exact scenario again in real life, exactly the way it is, but they will absolutely 100% see little snippets of it throughout their entire process. And if you put them all together, you get to that. So back to our story about the captain bleeding to death on the side of the road and the driver who's frozen in fear. The gunner said specifically that he was pulling security. Driver, go check on the guy. But the driver said, I cannot, I'm driving. Does that make any sense?
No.
Right? It doesn't make any sense. Right? And I know it doesn't make any sense, right? So the other vehicle saw what happened, they came back around, and the soldier got out, and what did he say? What happened?
Yeah.
Right? And then the gunner says, the team leader just fell out of the truck. Like, I think he's hit. So they go up to him, and then they put their hand on his chest and said, he's bleeding from his left torso, this and that, and then they patch him up, throw him in the vehicle, and move out. So we get to our after-action review process, and we say, good thing, what was the mission, blah, blah, what happened? And they said, the driver said, why didn't you help, what were you doing when the guy was bleeding to death? And the gunner asked him, what did you do? Why didn't you do anything? And he said, I couldn't, I was driving. And like, what the hell does that mean? Like, it doesn't mean anything. You were just holding the steering wheel. And the driver's like, yeah, I know, because that was my role. And I said, what was that captain doing while you were holding on the steering wheel? He's like, he was bleeding to death. Right. And let me ask you a question, soldier. Would you do that in real life? And you know what he said? No. And I said, why are you wasting my goddamn time? Right? I'm here to train you to the best of your ability. I'm here to see what you would do in the situations that I put you in, and that really happened in real time. If you don't do what you're going to do in real life, I can't judge you. All I know is that you were scared to do something because you thought you had a role of a driver or some shit. Like that's just crazy. So I need you to focus. I need you to get in the game and just do what you're supposed to do in real life so I could evaluate your task, right? And then someone else says, but that wouldn't happen in real life.
What?
And I said, oh, really? And then that's when, I was going to say, oh, really? I didn't get to that point. That's when all the other students were like, what the hell are you talking about? And then it's like, well, you wouldn't stop. And then they said, the team leader said stop. You stop in real life. That's what happens, right? And they all had this, they started eating each other. And I was like, all right, time out. I said, what happened? Not what we think happened and everything like that. What happened? The guy grabbed his arm, grabbed his body, said he was bleeding, told him to stop, and fell the truck. That's what you need to respond to. Not, oh, that wouldn't happen in real life. Because guess what? That's exactly what happened in real life in my deployment to one of our soldiers. And that's why I put it in the game. I mean, in the training, I'm sorry, not the game. It's just a game, Fokker. Right, so I put it in the game. And what happened is, what they were disconnecting was that we did our mission in the training center, and we were driving back, so they disassociated that training with this training. I never stopped the game, right? I never stopped the training. But they were playing the game in their head, and that's what you want to prevent. You want to get them to act like they would in real life. You want to get them to be who they really are and see what they really can do. We want them to make it real. That's what we try to do to the best of our ability. All right, so this is me, and during my training where I'm with 3 soldiers, right? That's not my soldier. I had another soldier who was a cool guy up with me. And then the explosion goes off in our training, and they take out my soldier and replace him with this guy who's all covered in blood. I'm like, oh, damn it. Right? And then we have to do our life-saving training on them and providing security. Right? So I did exactly what I would do in real life. And they said we did really well, and I was signed. But this guy right here is my team sergeant. And we were deployed together in Sri Lanka for 9 months. And because of this training, I trusted this man with my life. We were in the middle of a classroom before we even got to this part. And he's like, okay, this is how you dress a wound that's in a hard-to-reach place, like this pocket right here. And what he does is throws me on the ground, straddles me, grabs a ball of gauze, and jams it as hard as he could into my armpit. And it hurts so bad. But I know that if that happened in real life, this guy would do it without question. Right? So that's the type of real-world role-playing, real-world training that put my trust in him to even a greater extent.